All right, looks like we're now live for our monthly AMA. That's Ask Me Anything session. While people are streaming in, I'm going to make a little announcement. And here it is in the comments for anybody who's interested. On May 31st, I'm offering a one-day seminar on Friedrich Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morals. I think we have 8 or 9 people already signed up for it. So I will just leave that there for anybody who wants to see it. We'll wait until anybody's got some questions. So until then, we'll just, hang out and see who is. There we go. We already got one from John. Now, this is an interesting one. Is there a largely neglected school or field of philosophy which you think ought to have a revival in our lifetime? So, kind of tough to say about field because I think there's never been more people doing philosophy than right now and studying it. And it's like so many different places where it's happening that I don't know that we can actually say that fields are particularly neglected at this point in time. It kind of depends on where you are. Like if you're in a area where it's mostly people interested in analytic philosophy approaches, they may not even be like reading the canon of historically analytic philosophy, let alone other stuff, but they're probably, doing a lot of things. But that doesn't mean that like here in the United States, the next philosophy department down the line isn't already, focused on continental or classical American or comparative or philosophy as a way of life or, on and on and on. Now, thinkers, schools, you said, schools of philosophy. So, for a long time, people weren't paying that much attention to Hellenistic and imperial Roman philosophy. And nowadays, I would say that's improved considerably. There's a lot of interest, as everybody knows, in Stoicism, and not just in a popular sense, but also, I would say, in the academy as well, which is cool. Um, there could be more interested in skepticism and great eclectics like Cicero, in Middle Platonism, in addition to Neoplatonism. The Epicureans are well worth checking out. We might be getting some more documents from the Herculaneum stuff as they're able to, not unroll the scrolls anymore, but use the imaging stuff to do that. And there's a lot of good medieval philosophy that doesn't probably get looked at enough. I mean, everybody reads Augustine and Aquinas, but there's a lot of really cool thinkers along the way that are well worth checking out. And then later, Renaissance philosophers probably don't get looked at very often. There's a lot of early modern philosophers who, when we do early modern philosophy, we're like, okay, we got, maybe Bacon, and then we got, Hobbes, maybe some Machiavelli, and then we got Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, maybe throw Malebranche in there. Blaise Pascal is definitely worth checking out, but there's all sorts of other people along the way. And then, the British empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Maybe we want to read the common sense philosophers, or Joseph Butler. Joseph Butler is really quite interesting to check out. So and we could like keep on going. There's a lot of people, a lot of thinkers that maybe we should spend more time with, right? All right. Dan asks, did you ever struggle with hopelessness or feelings of self-doubt when doing philosophy in grad school? Yeah, actually I did. And I even approached, some of you have heard me talk about Rick Williams, my classics professor who I studied Plato's Symposium with for an entire semester, reading it in Greek. He was also my Greek first year teacher. in a class that had extraordinarily high attrition because he drove us pretty hard. And he was the head of the honors program at Southern Illinois University. So I was going through the sort of thing that I think quite a few people do when you're reading pretty broadly and you're going into the library and like looking at the stacks and you're like, oh my God, look at how many books there are here. I'm never going to read most of these, let alone all of them. And I'll probably forget half the stuff I read. How do I know what I'm doing here is worth anything? And what am I doing? I'm studying these philosophers so that I can like teach them and maybe reproduce their thoughts. I'll probably never have an original thought in my life. What the hell is the point of all of this? Right. So I think that's kind of a common experience that quite a few people have. And I went to Rick Williams and he had a great metaphor for this that I found. I didn't actually like it at the time, but I found it helpful as I thought about it. So I went into his office and I was like, I'm struggling with this thing. And he said, okay, well, I've been there as well myself. And so have a lot of other people. So I think of what I'm doing as tending a fire. And I'm sitting on a beach and there's a fire going. And, sometimes lots of people are by the fire. Sometimes it's just me. But my job is to keep that fire going. And anything else that I do is gravy. So if I do my job and somebody else wants to come by me and warm themselves at that fire and then stick around, and when I'm gone, somebody else will, feed that fire and tend it as well for other people, great. But if I die and that fire goes out, at least I tended that fire. And at first I was like, that's kind of BS. It doesn't address my issue, my problem. But over time, I've come to really appreciate that advice and think that, yeah, teaching at whatever level I'm going to, whatever students I get, great. That's a job. That's something for me to carry out. And I don't have to contribute in some new dramatic way to the field of philosophy. It's enough if I just get Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Cicero and a few other people right and turn other people on to them. That's good enough. That's great, I think, right? So that can help you, I think, put things into perspective. David says, love the fire analogy. That analogy is a good one for life. Yeah, so that's a good point. It could be applied to more than just philosophy, couldn't it? It could be applied to all sorts of stuff. Maybe you're the only person who does this traditional art form and nobody else seems to be interested in it. That doesn't mean that it's without value, right? So, all right. Not an academic says, I've been doing some research on existential phenomena, existential psychoanalysis today for class. Do you think Sartre has some great insight in his existential psychoanalysis that could be worth considering today? Yes and no. So Sartre has a weird take on psychoanalysis that he articulates, I think, most fully in Being and Nothingness, where he's like, these psychoanalysts, they say that there's all this unconscious stuff and it might be below the level of paying attention to it, but on some level it's not really unconscious. And I don't know about that. That seems to go a little bit too far. I don't think you have to be a psychoanalyst to think that there's an unconscious. William James thinks there is too, right? He's not a psychoanalyst. All sorts of people talk about that. So, does he have some good insight into ways in which people deceive themselves? Like the whole thing about bad faith. I think that's some pretty good insights, right? I think that he's wrong about how antagonistic he tends to make human relations, but insofar as our relations are antagonistic, I think his analyses could be helpful for some people, right? So I think that's good as well. There's a follow-up, particularly that there is no unconscious, but rather pre-reflexive consciousness that's sedimented with memories, emotions. I mean, does that have to be no unconscious? I don't think that he's necessarily right about that. So project, right? I propose personally we can extend his notion of original project. So like, always projecting ourselves out into something that isn't yet, to a more sociological level or collective original fundamental projects. Maybe, but probably not, because one thing you do observe with groups is that whatever some individual is bringing into it, other people in the group are, bringing up other stuff. And the trouble with Sartre is that he views human relationships ultimately as pretty antagonistic. This is something that de Beauvoir actually took him to task on. And so did Gabriel Marcel, by the way. So, yeah. All right. Here we go. Socrates' great-grandson, the late Daniel Dennett, was a proponent of integrating scientific insights from various disciplines such as evolutionary biology, computer science, cognitive science with philosophy. Can an integrative scientific approach to philosophy be useful? Yeah, to a limited extent, insofar as it's actually drawing on real science. A lot of evolutionary biology is pseudoscience. Same thing with evolutionary psychology. It's telling stories and then finding data. What were the other ones you brought up? Cognitive science, computer science, especially like the stuff with AI. Artificial intelligence at this point is just a metaphor, as is machine learning. And people who want to, project out that, machines actually understand things, pretty sketchy, not really scientific, right? So philosophy could actually be quite helpful in, examining those things and saying, hey, you didn't really think about this, or your analogy or metaphor is weak on this point. And if they're willing to like hear things from philosophers, sure. And philosophers should be well informed as much as they can be about, where current disciplines, actually, let's say disciplinary rather than scientific, because I don't think scientists are, at least the ones who think a lot about their disciplines, are like in complete agreement about what the sciences, plural, actually are, let alone science with a capital S actually is. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to do stuff about psychology, like I do a lot of stuff on philosophy of emotion, you probably should actually see what people doing experimental psychology have to say about emotions. But it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily buy into their views, their frameworks. You want to be relatively critical about that kind of stuff, right? All right. David Cox asks, who is your favorite ancient philosopher? I mean, I don't really have favorites anymore when it comes to philosophers, any more than I do when it comes to bands. If you would have asked me, teenage me, who's your favorite band, I would have immediately said Iron Maiden, right? And I still do love Iron Maiden, but they're like, maybe in my top 10 who kind of shift around. Motorhead is equally up there, as is Dio and, Judas Priest and Rat and others. And I would say it's the same with philosophers. At earlier stages in my life, you could have asked me, who's your favorite philosopher? And I would have been like, Jean-Paul Sartre. I went through a Sartre phase. Or, Jacques Derrida. I went through a Derrida phase. Or Thomas Aquinas. I went through a bunch of different phases where I was like, this person is the best. Now, I mean, if I had to, like, if you were holding a gun to my head and I had to like say somebody, it would probably be Cicero. But that would be because I, identify as a Ciceronian eclectic. I like his approach to studying philosophy and placing different philosophers and schools in conversation and sometimes conflict with each other and trying to sort things out for myself. I like that approach, but I don't think that Cicero is always right, about everything. And I think I probably would enjoy chatting with him if I had the chance. And, we had a universal translator because he doesn't know English and my Latin wouldn't be anywhere near as good to be able to do more than just say a few phrases. But, I like him, but there's many others that I really like. I love Aristotle. I love Anselm, I'm growing on Plutarch quite a bit the more that I teach him. And so we could go on and on with that sort of stuff. John says, will to power. The interpretation I got from Professor Lawrence Hemming is not a subjective position, but stands between people. Example, God's word will be found between people, but instead will to power is positioned between people as the word of God once did. I would say that is a pretty outlier position on the will to power. I don't know this Lawrence Hemming's point of view on it. There's literally thousands of Nietzsche interpreters out there, so you don't have to take that as me like bashing him. Nobody's got the time to read all these people, but that doesn't strike me as something that fits what we know about the will to power from Nietzsche's texts. I'm much more like, let's just go to the texts and not try to come up with some new adventurous interpretation, which this kind of sounds like to me. So I don't know that that's actually going to fly. But I mean, if you want to go down that route, you're free to do so, right? Luke Macri, good afternoon. I look forward to these every month. Hope things are good with you and yours. Yeah, things are pretty good. As some of you may know, if you read my Substack, I put out a newsletter with some actual news this month. Not every month do you have news necessarily. So I am now, the parent of only adult children. My youngest turned 18 and is going off to college in the fall. So I think there should be like some sort of like, you've made it. You saw them through childhood kind of designation that we have for parents of adult children. So that's kind of a cool thing. I'll be going down to Indiana for her graduation in the beginning of June. Another big news thing is I have been voted in as vice president of the board of Almost Home Cat Rescue, the place that I've been volunteering at for the last 2 years. And, the person stepped down. I stepped up, put my name in the hat and got voted in. So it's always nice to have people saying, yeah, we trust you. We think that you know what you're doing. And, it's kind of a nice time of year here. Things are getting warmer. We're just finishing up with the academic semester. So I'm fielding a lot of student emails and doing a lot of grading, but soon that will be behind me. And then I can focus on other stuff. So, all right. What is a good life? How should I live? Well, that's probably too generic to answer in a way that would be satisfying to too many people. I mean, I'm a virtue ethics person. So I think that virtue ethics provides, and not abstract virtue ethics like you're going to get out of an intro to philosophy textbook or somebody's website, but actually reading Aristotle, reading the Stoics, reading Plato, reading Plutarch, reading Cicero, thinking through these things, applying them, and not just staying way back in the ancient period, but reading contemporary people like Alistair MacIntyre or Christopher Gill or Julia Annas. I think that that provides, as far as I can tell, the best guidance, but you notice that it's a very complicated and not everybody in full agreement sort of, I hesitate even to say community, but why not call it community? So figure out what the virtues actually are, what you have to do to get them, figure out what's screwed up about you, which is oftentimes for many of us kind of a lifelong road that we have to progress down, because we often sort one thing out and then we're like, oh crap, I thought I had it all done. Now I've got this thing to deal with. I think a good life should include other people. It's not something to live as a solitary sage up on the mountain. Not that you couldn't have a good life by yourself, but I think that, and that you shouldn't like cultivate solitude, like, Rainer Maria Rilke reveals to us good insights about that. But I think that being able to live with other people is also quite important for a good life, and Aristotle thought that. Even the Stoics, who are like, a perfectly wise person could be just fine on their own. Read Seneca on the sage. The sage still needs other people in some respect. Needs is the wrong word, but it would be good for them to have that. Cicero actually has this wonderful observation. He says, if you were taken up to the highest heavens and could see the totality of the universe, which for the ancients was like, this is as good as it's going to get. He's like, it wouldn't be as good without a friend to share it with. So I think that's an important part of things. Epic Ninjali says, do you strategize around reading philosophical text? By that, I mean, do you explicitly have a plan for how to read or take notes on it? Most of the time, no. But you got to realize that I am not a particularly useful model for how other people do things. First off, we have different ways of learning. There's not just one right way to do it, or reading. And a lot of the texts that I am reading, I'm actually rereading, sometimes for like, the 20th time, because a good bit of my work is either like teaching students or producing resources for, self-directed learners, people who want to work on their own life, or I'm working with clients. So, I don't know how many times I've read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but it's probably at least 100 at this point. And I kind of know where I'm going. If I was going to need a strategy for reading it, that would not be particularly good for me. But if you're approaching it for the first time, maybe that could be quite helpful. But my first time for that work was more than 30 years ago, So when I'm like doing the work that goes into developing resources. So like, for example, down the line, I'm going to be teaching, it's actually going to be happening in June, a 8-week class on Stoicism and the cardinal virtues. That requires a lot of intensive research within the text, looking for particular terms, seeing where the arguments are being made, classifications. There, you could say I have a plan and I am taking notes, but I'm doing that precisely so that I can teach that class again. And I'm actually working on, eventually I'm going to write a book on that topic as a guide to help other people with that, because it's pretty tricky because it's in 2 different languages, Greek and Latin, and it's spread out through a whole bunch of different texts, what the actual positions are in the Stoic school. So, and when I'm reading a book for the first time, usually I just like read it through. I don't try to take notes on it. I might go back a second time and then possibly take notes, but my note taking is always very goal oriented. I'm not taking notes on a text just to take notes on it. I used to do that when I was younger, but then I found I didn't go back to my notes. Now, if you're a note taker, that might be very helpful for you, right? Mark says, hey, everybody, hope you're well. Good to see you here, Mark. Happy that you could make it. Jaden says, what do you think psychoanalysis is in relation to something like philosophical counseling? That's an unanswerable question, because psychoanalysis names like an entire plethora of different approaches that have developed over, roughly 120 odd years in a bunch of different schools. So there's no such thing as psychoanalysis out there that you can like compare to something else. You got to say Freud psychoanalysis or Jungian psychoanalysis or Lacanian or Reichian or, pick whatever else you want, or something that is blending. Most people doing psychoanalysis today, there's not that many of them out there, and doing it in a therapeutic way, not just a literary way or something like that, are also using some other stuff. So it's typically not like a purist thing. And philosophical counseling, likewise, there's two different certification bodies here in the United States, two different approaches. One is more focused on like critical thinking and logic. The other is focused in a humanistic way. So how are you going to put these into relation with each other? Some people who do philosophical counseling like certain psychoanalytic theories, others don't. It's not something that can easily be answered because it's at too high a level of abstraction. Hobbit, would you say I should write essays after reading philosophical texts and getting the essay checked by someone credible since I'm doing self-directed study, or shall I stick to discussing texts? Both of those are viable approaches. It's entirely up to you, Does writing essays after reading a text and then having somebody review the essay, does that help you to understand things better? If it does, then that's got some usefulness. If it doesn't, then it's kind of a waste of your valuable time. And probably the only way you'll find out is by trying it. We have many, many different ways of learning, and they're not like, it's not just that you should only do one and not do the other. You could maybe do both of those. You could certainly experiment at the beginning by seeing, well, what actually works well for me and what don't I get that much out of? And if you don't get that much out of something, maybe here's one thing that you could say. If you don't get that much out of something at the start, ask yourself, is this because it really is not going to pay off for me? Or is there something that's keeping this from being helpful for me that maybe I could address, and then down the line, it actually would be helpful for me. But I think that you really need to experiment a bit with that. And I wouldn't just only look at those two, like having discussions with people or writing essays. There might be a lot of different things that you could do to consolidate that learning, to promote reflection, to help you out with understanding the texts. As someone new to the Christian faith, can you give recommendations to better understand the faith? I started with C.S. Lewis and Chesterton. Where should I go next? That's, again, one of those things at that super high level of abstraction. There is no such thing as the Christian faith in a generic sense. There is, lots of different communities that people are using in different ways and understanding in different ways. And, there's lots of people out there calling themselves Christians where you're like, well, you're not a follower of Jesus at all, personally, I would say you should constantly be looking to the Gospels, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. Whenever anybody claims to be a Christian, that's usually the first question I ask them. How are you doing with that difficult set of requirements that are coming from the guy himself, who people, say is supposed to be the center of everything? I would say, you started with Lewis and Chesterton. Where should you go next? Who says you're done with either of those guys? Chesterton wrote an awful lot of stuff, as did Lewis. I'm not as big of a fan of Lewis as I like, Chesterton, although I don't like his racism and stuff like that. They're all kind of flawed people, but why not read some church fathers? They were people who, presumably knew something about Christianity. Why start with people that are like considered apologeticists in some respect? Why not like see what Lactantius has to say, or Justin Martyr, very early church fathers, right? Or Evagrius Ponticus, if you want to like get some insight into your messed up emotions and how to live things out, he's a great author, so there's like a million different places you could go. But I would beware of like, what I would do, I would say, listen, I just want to know something about how to live a life that's connected with this Jesus guy and his teachings and the values that he seemed to espouse. I want to learn from some other people who clearly knew some things about that. I would say that might be very helpful. Bark says, is there a virtue that exemplifies working today to provide for tomorrow? Something about how to create our own providence or how to maximize the providence created to us by the God. So create our own providence. I won't touch that with a 10-foot pole because I'm not God or a God. And if there is providence happening, it's going to be some being at that level, right? So I'm not going to create my own providence, and I suggest you probably shouldn't try to either. As a matter of fact, we have all sorts of great stories out there about people who try to do things like that, not calling it in those exact terms, but you could like, go and look around. Working today to provide for tomorrow. Yeah. I mean, that would fall under the virtue of prudence. Whether it's understood in an Aristotelian way or a Stoic way or Christian ways or stuff like that, practical wisdom would say you should probably think about tomorrow, and that should probably motivate your actions today. Some people think about like diligence or thrift or stuff like that. I guess that could figure into it if you need a specific virtue, but I don't know. To me, that seems like something that falls definitely into the realm of prudence. Now maximizing the providence granted to us by the gods. I mean, you don't maximize providence. You sort of collaborate with it or figure out what's intended for you if you buy into a notion of providence, so that you're not dragged kicking and screaming, but you actually collaborate with it. I mean, if you do believe in that sort of thing, then I guess whatever's going to get you to have a better understanding of what it is that God or the gods want for you, and then the things that you need to do in order to actually make that happen, to take impediments out of the way, would be important. So all right, what do you think about the Socrates gym quote? Do you think it's often misused or misquoted when people use it to argue every person should engage in physical exercise? Oh, okay, I didn't know what you meant by that. I'm not even sure that's a real quote to begin with, but it's definitely used by people who I would say don't have a clue about philosophy, let alone Socrates. Quotes are kind of I don't bother with them myself. They've never been something useful for me because I know that anybody can quote any sort of thing and it can make them feel good because it sounds cool, but it could have zero effect on their life. And quotes are definitely not enough to like structure making progress towards virtue, developing wisdom. As a matter of fact, I tend to think they work the other way around. That one sign of a person who isn't making progress is that they spend way too much time on quotes and not on other stuff. So I'm not a big, fan. You've seen me do the fake quotes videos where I call things out. So, I don't think much of that particular quote. I'm always interested in, if you're going to give me a passage, what's its context? Where is it coming from? What does it actually mean? So, All right, Stefan, when Kierkegaard talks about the night of faith, not fate, he said his character cannot make that movement. Do you know any person who can actually do that or example of it? If you're talking about fear and trembling, he actually says, yeah, there's tons of them around. Do we know for certain that any one person is a knight of faith? No, but we can suspect that they are. And I think that, given that the night of faith is going to, um, each one is going to have their own individual relation to the divine, right? Through the absurd. It doesn't actually do you any good to be told that somebody is a knight of faith, right? So the epistemological question: who's the knight of faith? Can you actually say that this person is or not? Um, it's kind of a distraction, I think. All right. Now here's an interesting question. Lenia, is it very difficult to become a philosophy professor? Yeah, it is. There are certain things that you can do, or that could be the case that could make it much easier for you. As a matter of fact, so easy that you might think that you deserve it, or that it's not a matter in large part of luck on your part. I would say it's also harder now, at least in the United States, and I also gather in Great Britain and maybe some other places, than it was in previous generations. So if you want to become a philosophy professor, and by professor, I'm guessing you don't just mean adjunct lecturer or something like that, but you're thinking like the traditional, you have your own office, you teach full time, you sit on committees, you do research, you eventually have tenure at a university or college. There are fewer and fewer of those jobs here in the United States. There's been a massive shift. Most of the people who do the teaching, myself included, are not professors in the traditional sense. Now, I actually have the title of adjunct professor at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, but you notice adjunct. So I'm not a full-time faculty member, which means that I don't get the same privileges and benefits that a full-time person would have, or protections, right? They can get rid of me at any time if they want to. So yeah, it is difficult to get those positions. When I was still on the job market and would apply in the fall, which is typically when all of that would happen, it was usually about 300 applicants for every position I applied for. Some maybe less, some maybe more. You're in direct competition with people who probably went to more prestigious schools and have more prestigious people writing letters of recommendation and greasing the wheels for them, because that's the way the game is played. The good news is that academic prestige doesn't really mean anything in terms of talent, intelligence, quality of work, or anything like that. I've seen some people come from Harvard or Oxford or London School of Economics who are just complete idiots, and people, they're just lucky they were born into a rich family where academic people open doors for them. I've seen some really brilliant people in very unprestigious places, and there seems to be no actual correlation between merit and getting those cush philosophy jobs. So the good news is talent is pretty widespread and it's not too hard to find. The bad news is that for a profession that values rationality, it's largely, who gets to be the professor is largely a matter of irrational, maybe even anti-rational processes. So, if you set your heart on becoming a philosophy professor, you are probably, setting yourself up for something that is going to be a very, very difficult thing to achieve. And you've got to get lucky. You have to have fortune on your side. Not impossible. So I'm not dissuading anybody, but it's important to be realistic. It's sort of like saying, I want to marry a 10, whatever that happens to be for yourself, and being, unhappy with anything other than that. Well, you're probably going to be setting yourself up for a lot of trouble, and it might not be attainable. But you might get lucky. Maybe you're in a rom-com and you actually do get that. So, all right. William says, my 16-year-old nephew started reading philosophical texts and has come for guidance to me as I teach philosophy for freshmen. What can I do to make sure he ends up falling in love with this field? Well, there's nothing you can do to make sure that'll happen. I think maybe the best thing to do is make sure you don't establish any impediments or turn them off, right? And that's probably not that hard to do, Um, don't put them down, encourage them, challenge them, but not like, the way that people sometimes do in analytic or continental philosophy circles where it's kind of mean spirited. And I think, probably here's what I would say. If there is something that you can do to encourage, it's not direct, but them seeing you deliberately making time in your day to read philosophical texts and show evidence of thinking about them or applying them to your life, finding them valuable, that there's no guarantee, but that is probably the best that you can do, right? So take them out to a coffee shop. You've got a book along. You'll chat with them for a while, and then you'll be like, I got to read this Plato because this is great shit, and love you, little nephew, but this is me time. You brought a book for yourself. Actually, bring a book for them too. Be like, oh, okay, you didn't bring a book for yourself? Here, read this one instead. But I'm going to take 30 minutes and read this, and we'll just sip our coffee or hot chocolate or whatever as we read together, as we do this together. That could actually work. Now that I say it, it sounds a little manipulative, but it's for good, right? You're actually showing them something good. Abraham, with regard to this idea of the return to Hegelian thought in analytic philosophy, it seems like the Hegel here is not faithful to the actual Hegel, and is a Hegel term more palatable for Analytica? Okay, so there's good news and bad news, right? The bad news is, yes, you're right. Anytime that an analytic philosopher claims that they're going to be doing some historical figure, one of two things happens. Either they screw up the thinker and they make it much more palatable for analytic approaches. And that's, I think, what happened with analytic Thomism, analytic studies of Kierkegaard, most of the analytic studies of Nietzsche, Plato. Analytics are pretty terrible at Aristotle, except for, the logical works as well. They just don't get the ethics stuff. When you're like, is Aristotle's theory of friendship altruistic or egoistic? You're like, oh man, you lost the thread. All you had to do is actually pay attention to the text. Or another thing happens, they actually get good at the history of philosophy, and they slowly cease to be analytic philosophers, which is what I think has happened with Robert Brandom. So his stuff is pretty decent, but that's because he doesn't fit in quite so well with traditional analytic philosophers. So that's the bad news, that their reads aren't faithful to Hegel. The good news is that almost nobody else's reads are faithful to the original Hegel. I mean, is Kojève and all these French Hegel people who think the phenomenology is the most important thing, and they kind of ignore the science of logic and the lectures and the philosophy of right because it's all about the phenomenology. Are they being faithful to Hegel? I don't think so. So good news is the analytics are not unusual in that respect. And why do we need to be like super faithful to Hegel? Is Hegel right about stuff? I mean, I don't take him as my go-to for understanding the world and history. There's a lot of cool stuff in Hegel. I think he's important enough that I did the half-hour Hegel series to help people understand the phenomenology, but that's not saying like he's the best or anything. So, all right, music question, Brian. Is there a contemporary 2020 plus metal band you're really into? No, I wouldn't say there is. I don't listen to a lot of new stuff because there's so much old stuff for me to re-listen to. Much of it, extraordinarily good and remaining fresh. If you'd asked me about 2010s on, I'd say yeah, Orchid. But they've broken up as far as I can tell. They're a doom metal band, probably one of my really favorites. I wish they'd done more albums because they are just so incredibly good, But yeah, I don't have a lot of time for listening to contemporary stuff because there's so much great old stuff out there. James, in your opinion, which philosophers have the best sense of humor? I wouldn't know because, I mean, all we really know about most philosophers is what we get through their works, and their works are just a tiny, tiny window into their life, and they don't necessarily put a lot of humor into their works. I mean, Shestov is pretty funny, but Shestov is, like this existentialist skeptic guy who loves to poke fun at stuff. So there's more room in there than there is, say, in Hegel or Thomas Aquinas or, people like that. I mean, even they make jokes once in a while. Hegel's got that thing with if somebody is going to claim that phrenology, and I'm just kind of like roughly paraphrasing here, that, somebody's like reducible to their face, so physiognomy, you should punch them in their face, right? That's kind of funny, right? That's probably a joke, but I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know about that. I do actually have a colleague who I haven't talked to for a while, Philip Dean, who's he teaches for University of Southern New Hampshire. He lives in Boston. Somebody I went to school with, think is a really cool guy and smart, but also very funny. He's done work on the philosophy of humor, and he would be a good guy to ask that question to. So, all right. Trustful, do you think the role of a philosopher is changing fundamental in these past few centuries as the way information disseminates and a technology evolves has changed so radically? I don't know what the role of a philosopher is. I don't think there's ever been an agreed upon role. I think there's a lot of things philosophers can do and do engage in, but it's pretty rare that somebody's like, okay, we got the job for you now here, Mr. Philosopher. And so, again, too high level of an abstraction. And philosopher names a lot of different things, right? There's lots of different kinds of philosophy. There are lots of different ways of being a philosopher. So it's kind of a non-starter. I mean, clearly things have changed a lot in recent centuries, but I don't know how that would figure into this. Instantly, I wanted to ask any advice or wisdom for a returning college student who plans to double major in English and philosophy who's just starting out. Okay. Returning college student. So you were in college and you had to leave, and now you're coming back and you want to major in English and philosophy. There's some overlap, there's a lot of philosophical literature. English often uses some ideas from philosophers. It's not a bad double major to have. it's tough to generalize because just here in the United States, there's about 4,000 places where you could major in philosophy. I don't know how many in English. And they're all different from each other. So it's not like there's a standard way of doing either of these fields. I would say one thing that you can keep in mind is whatever your professors tells you is the only stuff that you should study, guaranteed that's not the case. You probably got to do some study on your own. Or when they tell you like everybody's studying this, well, that's going to be BS, right? Because not everybody is studying this particular thing. Like people way, way back in the day would be like, everybody's doing ordinary language analysis. Well, no, they're not. There's all sorts of things that people were doing, even in analytic philosophy, at the time. So I would say don't get like, don't buy into, my professor says this is the only thing worth reading, so therefore I'm only going to read this, because very often they don't know. Oh, where I went to undergraduate in the 1990s, my professors who were just, a little bit away from retirement, one of them actually just died recently, and I think like 90 years old or something. They were convinced that there were only four main things going on in philosophy: analytic philosophy, which was going to die out pretty soon, Marxism, which they weren't really interested in, existentialism, and process philosophy, right? That's what they thought the field of philosophy encompassed. And they were pushing that, and luckily I read stuff on my own and found out that there was all sorts of other stuff going on as well. So you should probably be a little bit leery of that. Hank Smith, what languages do you speak? Well, obviously English, because I'm doing it right now. My family is on my mother's side is French Canadian. I learned to speak French. I can't like immediately do it, particularly as I get older. It takes a bit of like reacclimation, but the muscle memory is still there. I was actually talking to a colleague from Normandy at almost home. And we chatted a bit, and then we switched back to English so people didn't think we were talking about them. So, French I can get by pretty well. German takes me a little longer to get back up to speed. The last time I was in a German speaking area, I was what title they gave me? Visiting researcher, visiting scholar at the European Graduate School in Saas-Fee, Switzerland. And everybody there is speaking German. So, going to the grocery store, it took me a little while to get that back, but I can make do in German. And that's basically as far as speaking. I mean, I can read ancient Greek and I can read Latin, but those are not like living languages that we actually use, right? They're ancient languages, they're research languages. And I can read French and German a lot more quickly than I can comprehend spoken stuff, Bark, what was your ultimate opinion of the idea of pure experience presented by Nishitani Kenji and others? What do you think of philosophies that integrate it as well as those that ignore it completely? I don't even have an opinion, let alone an ultimate opinion, because I see it as a non-starter. I don't think we have pure experience, and I kind of don't care about it, Socrates says Matt Sticker is a professor of philosophy who's published articles on the virtuous skill thesis, arguing that the development of virtue should be understood as a process of skill acquisition. And he draws on the psychological research on self-regulation and expertise to formulate this thesis. Are you familiar with the notion of virtue as skill? Well, the notion of virtue as skill has been around a long time before him. I'm not familiar with his notion. And, calling it a thesis, anytime somebody says thesis, my antenna go up and I'm like, well, this is probably bullshit, because if it's being drawn from Aristotle didn't call anything a thesis, or the Stoics or people like that. And, it sounds like he's doing what we call experimental philosophy, much of which is not very good. Maybe his stuff is really good. I don't know. I haven't read it. But from, years of working in the profession, I'm a little leery of people who draw upon the psychological research, because I know how bad a lot of the psychological research is as far as study design. So, blank name, what do you think of Joan Kopchek's work? I don't even know who Joan Kopchek is, so absolutely nothing, you know. Joe, should a 32 something year old go spend money on being checked for BPD, bipolar disorder, or ADHD, or whatever, if it's not a serious problem? I mean, you just answered that. If it's not a serious problem, if it's not creating problems in your life that you're concerned about, then maybe not. But the mere fact that you asked the question makes me suspect that it must be some kind of problem, or you wouldn't be asking for advice about this. So I don't know. I guess you got to figure out, is this screwing things up in terms of relationships or getting in the way of like doing things that you want to do? If it is, then it sounds like it could be a serious problem, you know? Laps 9 Continuum. Good to see you here again. I know you're a fan of virtue ethics, broadly speaking. If you have to choose a campus, it's superior to deontology on your view. So why? So I don't do stuff like that. You know, if you're going to do virtue ethics, it's not virtue ethics. It's studying Aristotle and his followers and interpreters, or the Stoics, or Cicero, or Plato and Middle Platonism, or, you know, various stuff like that, right? Any good virtue ethicist is probably going to be tied to some particular school or tradition, but also taking in stuff from others. You know, McIntyre's a great example. You know, he says we need to learn from Mill and Kant and all these other people, and that's part of what it means to be a good Aristotelian. Same thing with deontology. There's no such thing as deontology per se. There's Kantian deontology. There's intuitionist, i.e. Rossian and Audian deontology. There's divine command theory. These are very different from each other, right? So it's at too high a level, again, of abstraction to say, is one better than the other? It's not a well-formulated way of approaching these matters. And I think that a lot of people learn about this stuff either from websites or videos or things like that work at this very high level of abstraction and are not connected with actual texts and thinkers, or from intro to philosophy classes and textbooks, and it's bad for them. What we should be doing is we say, well, there's a thing that we call deontology. Here's what it looks like when Kant does it. Here's what it looks like when Ross and Audi do it. Here's what it looks like when this person does it. And notice how Kant criticizes these other people in deontology for making God the center of these sorts of things, you know? All right. Let's see here. We've got Ketemetu. Was the concept of optimism, thinking positive, a practice in ancient philosophy? So that's a great question. Now, if you mean the kind of like, cheer up, Charlie, everything's great, you know, say into the mirror every day in every way, things are getting better and better and better kind of bullshit that people do. No, every ancient thinker would say, God, that's a stupid thing to do, you know? So if that's what you mean by optimism or thinking positive, no. But that said, deliberately choosing to look at what's good in your life as opposed to dwelling on the things that aren't good or what you don't have, or, you know, how things could be so much better. Yeah, I mean, they do say you should actually focus on what is good in your life. So this is, you know, advice that you find in Plutarch. You know, you could look at his work that I've been releasing core concept videos on, called On Tranquility, and I've got some more lined up on his how a person can be aware of their progress and virtue, where these are like important like criteria for how to make your life better. And, you know, focusing away from like, oh man, I don't have enough money, I'm not experiencing the kind of pleasure that I want, and like looking at things that matter more. Do I have good relationships? Am I moving myself away from vices and towards virtue? I mean, you could be thinking positive in the sense of saying, that's where I'm going to choose to put my focus. And notice that it is a choice. You do have an option for that sort of thing, right? So, yeah, I would say it depends on how you understand optimism in this case. Luke says, I read C.S. Lewis's Men Without Chest recently. Is his concern with moral uncertainty better represented in the existential problem of angst, and can education really help? I don't know that I have much of an answer about that one. I don't know that angst is an existential problem. It's usually understood as like an experience, and then it leads to a bunch of concepts, and it's discussed in different ways, right? So Kierkegaard's understanding is not precisely the same as Heidegger, is the same as Sartre's, so I don't know that you can answer that well. And same thing with like education. What kind of education are we talking about? Like just sitting in a classroom being taught, what's on the board and having discussions, or something more programmatic. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to have to take a pass on that one. Any thoughts on conceptual history as practiced by Joachim Ritter, Reinhard Koselleck? I don't know what they mean by conceptual history, so I can't have any thoughts on it. I'd be irresponsible to. All right. Andy, oh, good. Here's a non-philosophical question. You can pick only one guitarist for your band. Vivian Campbell or Randy Rhoads? Actually, who would be in your dream band lineup? 2 questions. Okay. So if I had to choose between Randy Rhoads and Vivian Campbell, I would actually choose Vivian Campbell. And the reason is because I think Randy Rhoads is great, but I also think that because he died so young, he's been overrated for a long time. I think that the stuff that he did was really awesome, but I think there were a lot of other really great guitarists out there at the same time doing equally great stuff. I'd actually say J.K. Lee, given the choice between J.K. Lee and Vivian Campbell or Randy Rhoads, I'd take J.K. Lee. And interestingly, that was Ronnie James Dio's first choice for his solo band. He wanted J.K. Lee, but then he realized Vivian Campbell was a bit more amenable to doing things the way that Dio wanted them. And Dio was a musical genius, and Dio was a consummate band leader. So J.K. Lee wanted the riffs a little bit more ornate, like you hear in, Bark at the Moon and Ultimate Sin, and then his subsequent work. But now in a dream band lineup, see, the thing with a dream band lineup is I don't know that you would get these people to actually function well together. So you could be like, oh man, who's going to be on bass? Well, that's an obvious one, Steve Harris, right? But if you got Steve Harris on bass, can you also have Ronnie James Dio singing? Ooh, I don't know, man. They're 2 very powerful band leaders and composers. Maybe it's better to have Jimmy Bain, as Dio did, on bass, who's also a great bassist, but he's no Steve Harris, Who are you going to put on guitar? Are you going to have 2 guitars or 1 guitar? If you've got a Vivian Campbell, could he work with an Adrian Smith? Could he work with an Adrian Smith the way that Adrian Smith works with Dave Murray? Maybe not. Maybe if you take Adrian Smith, you got to bring Dave Murray along, or vice versa, right? It's tough to do this sort of stuff. When it comes to drummer, I don't know. I'm not a big drum person, so I couldn't say. So I don't think I could put together a dream band anymore. But it is an interesting kind of problem to frame, right? Blank name, is Plutarch's a good way to learn Latin after learning the basics, or is it too difficult as a beginner text? Well, the good news is that you don't have to worry about that at all, because the bad news is Plutarch doesn't write in Latin; he writes in Greek, and his Greek isn't super difficult, but it's not what I would like start off with as a beginner. So, if you want to learn Latin, one of the easiest authors to read, because he deliberately wrote his works in that way, is Thomas Aquinas. That's if we're not doing classical Latin, that's often where we begin. Arda, how do you differ Heidegger and Hegel's ontology, phenomenology fundamentally? Do you find an attempt to reconcile these two thinkers in a unity is legitimate? So I'll answer the second one first. I would not try to do that, because they're two very different thinkers. And any sort of like reconciling them is probably going to turn out pretty poorly. And I don't know why you would want to, frankly. If I wouldn't, if you were going to say, okay, pick two thinkers who do phenomenology and have a metaphysics, because that's, ontology is basically metaphysics here. And we're going to somehow bring them together and overcome all the differences between their stuff. Who would I pick? It probably wouldn't be either of those guys, Gabriel Marcel, I'd probably say. And then I'd have to think about who the other person I'd want would be, So I'm not sure why even do that sort of thing. Socrates' great grandson, ChatGPT, said, well, if ChatGPT said it, well, it must be true then, right? I don't know why the hell you would put that in. While Aristotle described virtue as a hexis, Schichter makes it more precise by likening it to expert level skill, emphasizing flexibility, intentionality, and intelligent responsiveness. Okay. Great. Aristotle didn't just describe it as a hexis, so ChatGPT is not where you go to get information about philosophy. And this just shows why. That's one thing he says about virtue. He says a ton of other stuff as well. I don't know that this Schichter guy is somehow more precise. Depends on what we mean by precise, doesn't it? So, all right. Santiago says, do you have any favorite movies? For my part, I'd say two: Shawshank Redemption and The Sunset Limited by McCarthy. They have very deep themes like freedom, God, and suicide. If I had to say a favorite movie, I think it probably still would be, although I haven't seen it for a while, Ridley Scott's The Duelists, which is based on if I remember right, a Pushkin novel. It's got Harvey Keitel as the a-hole, and Keith Carradine as the protagonist. And it's two French Napoleonic officers who fight a series of duels imposed by the a-hole officer during the course of the Napoleonic campaigns, all the way up to the end of the Napoleonic era. And it's very well acted, beautiful, just gorgeous scenery, great sword play. They even used pistols at one point, and great music. And I've always liked it quite a bit. But I don't know. I don't actually watch a lot of movies these days. Most times I'm actually now watching series more often. So. Isa Goge, do you have any thoughts on the philosopher and linguist Noam Chomsky? I've talked about this quite a bit. As a philosopher, some of the stuff that he says is sometimes okay, certainly consistent. As a linguist, I don't buy his linguistics. People have been recommending him to me, and I checked him out back when I was a graduate student, because I was doing philosophy of language, and I was like, wow, this is pretty crap. So, yeah. Nady, how do you get the time to make all of this? I make good use of my time. You know, I don't fritter it away doing endless crap on social media. Um, I'm not out partying. I did that when I was younger, I'm married, so I don't have to like try to date anybody. I've got, a wife that I'm very happy with. And I get to, a lot of the things that I do, like shooting the videos, I can use those for my classes, right? So they serve some sort of purpose, but I only get about half of what I want to get done in terms of video and writing and podcast and other things. So yeah. All right. Mel, I've been reading about how some modern philosophers are trying to use Aristotelian ideas like potentiality and actuality to make sense of quantum mechanics. What do you think about that approach? I don't know. I don't know enough about quantum mechanics to say how a sort of traditional Aristotelian notion of uh, potentiality and actuality would help to make sense of it. So that's not really in my wheel well. Doc, I remember you quoted Todd McGowan in your paper on McIntyre and therapy. Have you read his works on Hegel and political topics in general? If so, what's your opinion? I don't know what paper you're even referencing, McIntyre and therapy. So, and I certainly don't remember quoting Todd McGowan. So I don't know. Sonny Blue, how are the online live Plato classes going? How international is the cohort? Are there live discussions? Couldn't fit it in this time, but hope to join some in the future. Wishing you all the best. Yeah, it's actually going very well. It's a particularly engaged bunch of students, some of whom are from North America, so U.S. and Canada, others located in other parts of the world, including South Africa and Great Britain. Where else am I thinking of? Sweden. No, it's not Sweden. Norway. What a dumb mistake. Two very different places. And yeah, we're having some really, really great discussions. As a matter of fact, so I always schedule 90-minute class sessions. We typically end up going for 2 hours. And today we actually went on to about, I think, 2 hours and 20 minutes for one of the shorter dialogues, the credo. But, you get into good discussion. You don't want to end it. So yeah, it's good. We're definitely going to do it again next year, because I think it's a good draw. I'm actually, a lot of the like issues and questions that people are bringing up are making me do a lot of thinking about stuff and about what we actually really do know about Plato's point of view on things. And so it's really quite rewarding. The next big class will be Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues, but we do have that Nietzsche one-day seminar coming up as well, so you might want to check that out. Joe History Sucks. Ridiculously broad question. Which genre of fiction is generally the most philosophical? That is a good question. Genre of fiction. Okay, so I would say speculative fiction, but that's a cop-out, right? Because it's already got speculative in the title, and speculative fiction is like this big umbrella category that includes fantasy, sci-fi, horror, alternate history, utopian / dystopian, superhero, all these other sorts of things. So I don't think you can say speculative fiction. It's probably not other genres like romance or, mercenary / military or detective, although detective novels, if they're good, are, exploring ethical issues. I think about Raymond Chandler, or they're like, you got to do a lot of thinking along the way, like who actually did this sort of thing. And sometimes they can be within speculative fiction. Think about G.K. Chesterton, Father Brown stories, right? Or Harry Dresden's, not Harry Dresden's, Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden novels, which are supernatural and detective fiction at the same time, set in Chicago. So this is a really interesting question that's been raised within speculative fiction communities. Is like science fiction more or new weird more philosophical than, say, fantasy or horror? It's kind of hard to say, isn't it? Because I think we could think of examples of authors who really are pushing the envelope. I mean, if you want great like philosophical reasonings about stuff, one fantasy series I would suggest is Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is just amazing, you know. But we've got some great sci-fi stuff as well. What I wouldn't say is that like the high modernist fiction is automatically the most philosophical, although I think a lot of them would say that it is, right? And we also have some like great like essays and stuff. So Ursula K. Le Guin, science fiction fantasy author, also an essayist, really profound philosophical stuff. Stanislaw Lem, science fiction author, makes a lot of really important distinctions within science fiction. So that's quite interesting as well. All right, Leslie, if I'm working on mastering Aristotle's rhetoric but would like to further my skills, would it likely be more beneficial to study the new rhetoric? I'm assuming you mean Chaim Perlman and Ulbrecht Statica. I'm probably mispronouncing their name, New Rhetoric, or Institutia Oratoria. I haven't read that, so I can't compare effectively. But I don't know how you master Aristotle's rhetoric. Maybe what you memorize every portion of it or something like that, and then do a lot of exercises. I mean, the New Rhetoric is an amazing book. I can tell you that it is really quite good and well worth reading, even if it has nothing to do with Aristotle. Although, of course, you will get a lot of Aristotle in it. So I think that's the best that I could say. Sunny Blue, do you still take on philosophical counseling and coaching one-to-one with individuals? Yeah, I do. I still have clients. I wouldn't even say still. I never thought about not doing it. Separate question, how meaningful has this role been for you personally and professionally? I mean, professionally, I think I'm well regarded within the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. They've asked me to do agoras, and I've presented at the annual conference. I probably should start writing up some case studies, because that's typically what you do, and I've been doing it for over 10 years now. I was certified in 2014. So this is my 11th year of doing it. Personally, I really enjoy it. I find I was doing it before I actually got certified anyway, because it's part of what I like to do with philosophy is help people with life problems. And I get satisfaction out of having dialogue with people and saying, Aristotle would actually have something useful to contribute here, or here's maybe what, Rainer Maria Rilke would say about what you're going through. And here's some stuff for, controlling your anger from Seneca. And then we have a conversation about it. I think it's really quite helpful, So, all right. Fairnon says, what do you think about Graham Opie atheism? I don't know, because I don't read Graham Opie. Blank name, thoughts on Ibn Arabi. I'm aware you don't specialize in Islamic philosophy, but would like to hear your opinion if you read him. I haven't read any Islamic philosophy for years and years, and so I don't have anything to say about that. Doc, I stared in the abyss for too long. What should I do? I think it's gazing back. Well, talk to it. Maybe it's just lonely. It's an abyss. So you don't know that it's a bad thing. Mentioning Rilke says, how do we know that what we think to be dragons aren't really something else that needs our love, right? So I don't know. Try loving the abyss. See how that goes. Jimmy, are there any recommendations you have for studying Leibniz, particularly as metaphysics? Also, what do you think about idealism in general? Yeah, I mean, you can start with reading Leibniz by jumping into like the shortest text, like the Monadology, but then you're like, what the hell is this shit? Everything is a windowless monad that reflects the rest of the universe. You're like, what's he on about, right? So it's probably better to work through some of his selected essays first. I mean, he does have one big book, a couple big books that you could read on their own, right? But there isn't like a single starter text that is the intuitive place. The Monadology for Leibniz functions very much like the categories do for Aristotle, where people are like, well, this is going to be the introduction to this guy. Here's what you're getting, or the discourse on metaphysics too. And you're like, oh, what the hell is this crap, right? This isn't an introductory text at all, weirdly enough, though, Leibniz did think of the Monadology as like a bullet point form of his philosophy. So, all right. Syed says, I'm looking to delve into some political philosophy. Can you recommend any interesting non-mainstream political philosophers to get into? Maybe somebody in the vein of Carl Schmitt. No, because I'm not into non-mainstream political philosophers. I think somebody else would be a good person to ask that. I don't know what is the mainstream for you. You mean not John Rawls? I mean, why wouldn't you just begin with ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle? You got a book called The Republic and a book called The Politics. If you've already read those, there's plenty of other stuff. Hobbes's Leviathan is good, but you're saying you're delving into it. So, why would you begin with something 20th century, Bark, would you consider Claude Shannon a philosopher? I don't even know who Claude Shannon is, so I couldn't say. Linnea, then is any easier to become an assistant philosophy professor? This is going back to, is it hard to become a philosophy professor? So the answer is no, it's not any easier, because first you have to become an assistant philosophy professor, assistant professor of philosophy, and then you move to associate, then you become full. But what I was talking about was just getting your foot in the door as assistant philosophy professor. It's not like assistant professor doesn't mean like you're working for somebody and helping them. It's just a rank. It's the bottom level of full-time tenure track philosophy person. So Lucas Alazar, why is Ricoeur studied along with Heidegger? I don't know that Ricoeur is studied along with Heidegger, but Ricoeur is definitely worth studying for his own sake. Lapse 9 Continuum, Jake Lee's a great choice. One more question. We're living in tumultuous times. Politically, do you ever find yourself feeling nervous about it? If so, how do you cope? I don't find myself feeling nervous. I can recognize how precarious things are, and how, essentially the Trump administration, number two, is rapidly unraveling norms that we do need kept in place, and they need kept in place foolishly, willy-nilly, with terrible long-term effects, right? Our alliance system is being taken down. Our economic system, both internally and externally, is getting really screwed up. The political system, they're trying to rig everything as much as they can. That's not going to work. They're trying to, feel out whether we can use the military to crush political dissent. If the military decides to go against them, they're screwed, And so there's a lot going on, but I mean, it's not like we haven't gone through similar things in other great civilizations in the past. It doesn't have to lead to us all being doom and gloom. You can live a great life even as things are falling apart. So, and does it prevent you from caring about the people you should care about or anything? I don't think so. All right, we're getting close to time. Takman, do you consider any answer to the skeptical challenge good? Brain in a vat? I don't know what the skeptical challenge is. What, that we could be a brain in a vat? I don't really work that way, like worrying about answers to challenges or stuff like that. So, Anthony Sanchez, what would you say are some key differences between ancient Stoicism and modern Broicism? Modern Broicism is for alpha wannabes who are all betas and need to talk up what tough guys they are and, say Molon Labe and stupid things like that. And, buy trucks they don't need and posture and stuff like that. What's the difference between that and ancient Stoicism? Ancient Stoics would look at those people and be like, wow, what a bunch of idiots. It's that straightforward. Black Swan, what career can I make in philosophy about getting a graduate degree in it? I'm not sure what you're asking there. Without getting a graduate degree in it, is that what you're asking? Or in order to get a graduate degree? Nady says, what's your favorite philosophy work of each era? I don't really have favorite philosophy works any more than I have favorite philosophers. Unlisted Logos, Wolfgang Smith is a physicist who postulates quantum mechanics is more coherent under an Aristotelian framework than a Cartesian one. Oh, okay. So this is a reference back to the other thing. Good for him. I don't have anything to say about that. Blank name, since you have a degree in math, have you encountered Noether's theorem? Nope. My math degree, I had double majored in philosophy and mathematics and graduated with it in 1994. Hope your spring is going great. Yeah, it's pretty nice, Elmo Mears, do you have any hobbies you rarely talk about on the channel? Good question. Not really. I mean, I talk about my volunteering at the cat shelter. I talk about metal. I have a monthly classic metal class with my friend Scott. I do a lot of posting of stuff from my walks in Milwaukee or events that we're at. So I don't really have a lot of, I would say, hobbies that don't get airplay in any way. All right, let's pick people who we don't have questions from yet. Actually, I did one with Joe History Sucks. Appreciate you not copping out on speculative fiction. Thanks for everything you do. Okay, so that's not a question, but glad that you enjoy it. Kyriakos, how can I compensate for a bad first degree mark if I want to pursue postgraduate philosophy in postgraduate study, what we would call graduate study here in the States in philosophy? Most doors are closed because my mark is too low. Do I get a second degree? I don't have a clue because that's a whole different system than what we have over here. So somebody else would have to be where you go for that. Adam, what are your thoughts on transhumanism? Do you think humans ought to eventually take hold of their fate and transform themselves into perfect beings? Well, that's assuming that we can actually take hold of our fate and transform ourselves into perfect beings. I think a lot of transhumanism is basically sci-fi projections and people sitting around and going, oh man, that would be so cool. Wouldn't that be awesome? And, they often are pretty light on the hard science part of it, right? So I don't take a lot of transhumanist talk very seriously any more than I do pot smokers sitting around and speculating about what if a pizza ate us, man? So all right. Well, I don't know what this one is. It doesn't look like it's finished. Kurup, Would you recommend any way of going about studying the philosophy of language? I'm interested in the nature of reference, not sure how I should proceed. Yeah, I mean, there's like, it's a well-established field. We could say it starts with Plato's Cratylus, right? There's plenty of stuff you can go on. If you're really interested in reference, look up people who have things in the philosophy of language about reference, right? All right, so here we go. Have you read some Jaspers? Yeah, we read him back. I mentioned, existentialism was big when I was an undergraduate, and we read Jaspers. I never like really resonated with him like I did some of the other existentialists. I will say this: I went to the North American Jaspers Society session in when I was at Society for Phenomenological and Existential Philosophy back in the 90s. And it was all, there were 6 people there. I was the only one who wasn't a member of the society, and they were all old, and I was like, is this what being interested in Jaspers is? And they were all like talking about, transcendence and things like that. And it seemed kind of like a club more than anything. So I don't think there's a whole of a lot of interest in Jaspers these days. Doesn't mean he's not worth reading, but I just haven't found anyone else who is really into him, So Nady says, would you have voted for Zizek? Voted for what? I mean, you'd have to have an actual contest or election. There's nothing about Zizek that makes me say, oh, yeah, he'd be a good person to have in charge of anything. So I don't know. Zach says, you said you're a virtue ethicist and live life by combining concepts from many different philosophers like Aristotle and the Stoics. I don't see here we go. Here's the follow-up. I'm wondering what concepts you take from each writer, how you combine them into a good system. Yeah, there's that's not a like end of session quick answer, right? We'll just use like a couple examples. So one thing that I do a lot of work on is anger management. Plato has some really good insights into what makes us angry, articulated in the Euthyphro, Gorgias, Republic, and a few other places. Aristotle has a lot more stuff that he's probably the first person to look at anger across a couple different things as a psychologist, as a physiologist, as an ethical matter. The Stoics give us all sorts of great reflections on how anger works. Plutarch has a great text on controlling anger. Later Christian thinkers have all sorts of cool stuff, often responding to that. So you just kind of bring it together and, think about how it works. Here's the one that we'll go out on. Stephen Hawking has famously said philosophy is dead, and other scientists have expressed this opinion as well. What is the purpose of philosophy? How would you rebut Hawking's on philosophy? I would say Hawking's an ignoramus. And why would you possibly believe somebody who makes a wild claim about philosophy being dead, as if philosophy is just one thing, who hasn't studied much philosophy and has a history of kind of blathering on about areas outside of his discipline? I mean, there was a philosopher who actually in the ancient period talked about running into people like that. Socrates in the Apology. These disciplinary experts, craftsmen, they really know their field well, but man, are they dummies outside of their field. You don't have to refute it. You just keep on doing philosophy and don't worry about dipshits like Hawking's or Neil deGrasse Tyson or any other person who's going to be like, oh, philosophy is no good. We scientists have replaced it. You'd be like, come on, where are you getting this bullshit from? So that could be a good, useful thing. You don't have to rebut people who say stupid things. It's not your responsibility. And I mean, if you want to, you can just point at like what gets done in philosophy these days and say, are you sure it's dead? But why would you bother? It's sort of like, having a conversation about relationships with an abuser, or a narcissist. Why would you bother? it's not worth the time, So, all right. So that is where I'm going to end this. I got to get myself some food before I got to go on to another event, philosophy chat for my Patreon supporters. So thanks to everybody for your questions and comments. And we do this every month. So, you can just check the Reason.io calendar, shows all the events I got coming up. I also put this on Facebook and other places. So it's always the first Saturday of the month. And as I mentioned, if you're interested, I do have a special seminar on Nietzsche coming up on May 31st. We've already got, I think, 8 or 9 enrollments in it. So it's filling up pretty quick. And maybe you'd be interested in that. We're going to go over the genealogy. Otherwise, have a great month, and I will see you down the line.